Lisa, thanks so much for joining us in the Culture Eats Everything podcast today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You are welcome. You're welcome. I'm excited to talk about the topic because you have wrote a fascinating book called Mind Knots, the understanding the cognitive and emotional biases that prevent rational leadership, which I know our audience is going to be very interested in. We've got lots of leaders, lots of CEOs. And so getting into what are these sort of cognitive undercurrents, as you call them, and how do they affect us? And the context of leadership and culture shaping and team forming. And so let's jump right into the title and talk about what exactly is a mind nut. I know you gave me a couple examples of them, like egocentrism, control, optimism. So those are some examples, but what more fundamentally is a mind nut in your perspective?
Good. Well, yeah, I think that's a great place to start. These are psychological biases, right? They come in two flavors: cognitive, which are rooted in thought processes, and, and the absence of logic really is what a mind knot is about, but it's the cognitive piece. And the second part of it is emotional, how we emote, right? That's the emotional intelligence part. So that's what they are. And the problem with them is, there are so many of them. We all have them, but there are over 200 of them. So what I really, in the work that I do with leaders as an executive recruiter, I'm really focusing on what are the leaders' prominent biases. Often they don't even know, right? These are things that many people are not aware of because it does affect their leadership, their outcomes, the organization, the culture, on and on and on, even the business ecosystem. In the book, I take it right out to the ecosystem because that is what happens. So I think about it this way. These are they're shortcuts, mental shortcuts that just we put into play in response to a situation. Um, they don't involve a lot of thinking because they're just mental habits that over time we've acquired. And that's a problem, right? It works okay if you're, crossing the street and you see a car coming at you fast. If that mental shortcut kicks in and says, get the heck out of the way, that's a great thing, right? But in leadership and in business, we're talking about complexity. There's no room. Mental shortcuts don't work. We have to think. And so that becomes the challenge for people who are not aware of biases or don't even understand their own. How do they pause? How do they take that deep breath and go, okay, everything within me is saying, make this decision, behave like this. I have this emotion. Generally, it's not really it doesn't often serve us well. So how do we gain an awareness, recognize them, and be able to intervene, right? Strategies to intervene to just protect ourselves from ourselves. That's really that's why I chose the term mind knots, because they are these tightly woven knots in our minds that we really have to kind of make sure we can sort of unravel for performance and for outcomes and just to optimize our success.
It reminds me, I was about 25 years ago now. Geez, time flies. But I was walking through the Selous Game Reserve in southern Tanzania, Africa. It's the world's largest game reserve. It's about 19,000 square miles, just absolutely enormous. And so we did a walking safari. It was just magical, and seeing giraffes and elephants and up close and personal. And it was a long day. It was hot, obviously. And we're coming back to the camp at the end of the day, and we had to cut through a small patch of forest that was single file line. And the leader at the front, who by the way was carrying a machine gun to protect
Yeah.
us, just in case, all of a sudden I hear this scream and someone hits me and I fall backwards and I hit the person behind us and we kind of all tumble like bowling pins. And come to find out, the leader, who was basically two people in front of me, almost stepped on a black mamba. And for those of you
Oh,
who don't know, a black mamba is called the two-step snake because you've got about two steps, and if he bites you, and until you're dead. And
oh,
so this was a dark-skinned African, from Tanzania, and he was white, because over there it's the most feared animal that there is because of this poisonous venom. And it is, and
Incredible.
when you said, when we're walking the street and our mind kicks in, it made me think of that story, because that's part of our biological heritage, right? It's a gift that we don't have to stop. He didn't have to stop and say, "Hey guys, there's a black mamba here. What do you guys think we should do? Let's get a committee together and talk about it." He just reacted, and thank goodness, because he didn't step on it. He just missed stepping on it, and
Mhm.
probably saved himself, or maybe saved one of us from getting killed potentially. And so it is a huge gift. The challenge is nowadays we don't have a whole lot of black mambas in our
Mhm.
environment, especially in the workplace, especially
Mhm.
in the first world. But we do have people's words, we have people's text
Yeah.
messages and their emails and Facebook posts. And so as you're working with leaders, how do you help them to become aware of when these mind knots are not serving them as well as they and they don't even realize it?
Yeah. So that's part of the strategies, right? Once a leader can say, okay, I get it. I understand. I'm not sure really what my prominent my nuts might be, but it's really about taking that moment to think before you make a decision, before you uh, act, before you emote. It's that pause is so important. So, one of the frameworks that in the book for every bias I talk about is a 5-step process. And the first step is pause, a conscious pause. So somebody says something to you and you immediately want to jump on that and respond, but maybe not. Like, take that pause, take that moment to think. That's number one. The second is perspectives. So, huge in business and in decision making. We can talk about groupthink, and we could talk about conformity bias, and we could talk about all these things that get in the way of really good decision making. So, getting perspectives, because, these things are in our minds, they're in us. We're like talking to ourselves all the time. So, we're not really being rational. We're rationalizing with ourselves, right? We're actually confirming things we believe or things we think we remember or things that the way we interpret them. So perspective. So on a leadership team, that's what it's all about, right? We put an issue on the table and you need to get cross-functional perspective, the whole thing. So that's number 2. 3 is processes, right? And practicing. So let's talk about practicing first. Um, Practicing the pause, practicing getting perspectives, practicing questioning yourself. Let's talk about egocentric bias. Am I thinking about this from my self-driven filter, or am I thinking about it from an organizational, higher purpose, mission perspective, right? That's an important question. And I want to go back to that later. I have a great question, that a takeaway for everybody. And then there's, putting processes in place, structure, basically to protect ourselves and our organizations. I call them organizational buoys. If you think about any business, businesses have practices and they have processes. Why? To manage and channel decisions, behaviors, so things don't go completely off the rail, right? We put in some structure to ensure that there's some predictable way that we will think about something, choose something, handle something. My nuts are no different, right? If we can put in on an individual level a set of processes or triggers that we can use to go forward in a more rational way, and then take that out into an organizational level, which is even more important because the impact is so much larger. So that's 4 things, right? So conscious pause, the get perspectives, practice intervention strategies, put processes in place. And then the last thing is like track your progress, right? It's no different than KPIs, right? Put the right things in place so that you're tracking it. Maybe on an individual basis, that means paying attention to your patterns. Well, see, it seemed to have leaned in that direction in the last 5 decisions I've made. Okay, how did that work out, right? Was that successful? Was it not? Was it mixed? Patterns of Are you getting perspective? Are you really letting other people in? Patterns of how your emotions may be getting in the way and muddling different decisions you make and actions you take is kind of how I frame it. So the progress part is where we learn, because we look back. We're not always looking ahead. We're looking back. We're saying, okay, how's it going, right? How much progress am I making? Are my decisions improving? Are my relationships improving? Because I'm behaving better, different. My emotions are more controlled with people within my sphere and the organization. Do I see a change rippling through my leadership team? Because am I setting the right example, right? Do I see a difference rippling through the organization because my leadership team is now behaving in different, better ways, making better decisions, treating people better? So, I'm translating kind of the subconscious sciencey part of these biases to how they actually affect a leader and an organization. And even, like I said before, the ecosystem, because how people behave within an organization is how the reputation of the organization is presented to suppliers, vendors, customers, what have you, right? It's all connected. So these are
So
foundation.
yeah, so go back to the first step, which is to pause. There seems like there's a
Mhm.
step before that, which is to actually even notice it in the first place. What advice do you have there? How do people notice that they're having a reaction of some sort?
Yeah, well, I think it is noticing, but even the conscious pause, whether you recognize or not, it's just a good practice for all of us to think before we act, right? Or before we speak. So, but yes, to your point, how do people even, begin to become aware of this, right? It is really about, that's why I wrote the book, is to raise awareness. Hey, here's what these, you might recognize them in terms of how they play out the symptoms, but they're there. And so you need to understand them. You have to learn about them, right? In an organization, I really am a promoter of creating a bias-aware culture, bias-aware leadership that comes through programs, right? Awareness programs. Here's what it is. Here's what it looks like. Here's questions you can ask yourself to identify whether you have these tendencies. You can track patterns, you can see. More importantly, other people see them. So many times we don't necessarily see the biases in ourselves, but other people do. We can spot them in other people well before we spot them in ourselves. And so you need to listen. You need to pay attention, right? If somebody is constantly saying, like, why are you always shutting down that idea or this concept? Tell us why. That offers an insight to someone's bias. Maybe they're risk averse. Um, on the other side, maybe they're complete optimists. And so they're ignoring risk. So when the CFO is saying, this doesn't look or smell or feel right, and the data is showing us that that might not exactly play out the way, Mr. CEO, you think it's going to play out. Let's really pull this apart. But you have a CEO who's like, it's going to work. Trust me, it's going to work. Other people will look and say, that's just irrational. It's just completely optimistic based in not good business reasoning, right? So other people spot them more quickly than we will spot them in ourselves. But if we are at least know to be aware, we should be listening and we should be coachable and we should say, you know what, there's some truth to that. I do feel like that. I do think like that. My patterns do tend to always lean on the optimistic side of things. My best business partner at that point would be someone who leans on the pessimistic side. Neither one on its own, by the way, is the answer. That's the interesting thing about opposing and countering biases. Neither one is the answer. When you can take the best of both and pull them together, that's what I call the rational solution. And that is the biggest part of the book in terms of how do you help somebody because, I should have started out by saying there are three truths to biases. Number one is it's a human condition and no one is immune. Not any one of us is immune from them. They are our mental lens. And so we need to pay attention to that. And in terms of leadership, it's a package deal. When you hire a leader, and I'm an executive recruiter, so I do this all day long, their biases come with them. And so it becomes important to understand how they're going to lead and how they need to be coached, managed. It also becomes important when you think about the composition of the leadership team. Are there good business partners that can counter some of those biases, right? And then the other truth is that, they can't be eliminated at all, but they can be managed. And so that's where we're talking about how do you recognize them? How do you become aware of them? What can you do about them from an individual leader perspective and from an organization perspective?
Yeah, I like that idea that they can be managed, they can actually be leveraged. And I appreciate your balanced approach here, that they're not good or bad, they just are. And then how do we leverage them, and especially in a team context? When we do our work with CEOs across the country and superintendents of schools and their executive teams, we always do our work in teams, because you need a team to help each other. You need the power of the team to make each other more self-aware of, hey, when you said that, or when you jumped in first with that thought, Mrs. CEO, it sort of put a damper on the conversation, not intentionally, but no one else was willing to speak up because you spoke first, as an example. And
Mhm.
so having the team being willing to have the courage to speak up and to support each other is part of the magic of doing culture work in teams, because we can all help each other, as none of us is perfect. And one of the examples you give is, egocentrism, that it's not necessarily a bad thing, although the word by itself, most people look at like, oh, that's bad. So talk a
Mhm.
little bit about that one in particular, and what's the sort of pluses and minuses of egocentrism.
Yeah. So, it is interesting. Most people react very negatively to that because we have perhaps have all had experiences working for or alongside someone who's, a narcissist, even worse, right? And has a very strong egocentric bias. This is not pretty. And it does create a lot of problems in the organization. However, um, most position briefs or descriptions that are seeking leaders, CEOs, leaders of organizations, if you really dissect them, the narratives really do highlight many of the very positive characteristics of what accompany egocentrism. So, drive, intensity, commitment, energy. It's like they're unstoppable things that businesses are attracted to because they see the potential for someone to lead the mission to a completion, and a very good one. And so, confidence is another big thing, right? So these are all positive things when they're managed and when they're controlled and not out of the atmosphere, right? And that's the problem with egocentrism. If it's not managed, it becomes a real problem for a leader and for an organization. So that's a very prominent bias at a senior leadership level. On the other side of that, though, so in my perspective and book, I talk about, well, how do you counter that? Because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some really good stuff characteristics that accompany somebody who might be egocentric. So we have to consider things like, okay, altruism is the countering bias, right? Once again, altruism on its own, not so good for a business because that's completely selfless. A business exists to profit and to, right, take something into the world that helps other organizations or people. So altruism on its own is not the answer. Egocentrism on its own is not the answer. But when you take the best characteristics that accompany an egocentric leader, and you take the best characteristics that accompany a more altruistic leaning leader, and you can pull those together, that's the magic. And so if it can't, if a person doesn't have enough emotional intelligence or has not matured enough to, and I don't mean mature, I mean maturity in the sense of understanding this concept, you can give them a business partner that has the countering prominent bias to work together and help them through. And then there are many other things I lay out about what a person could do to even help themselves counter that or manage it. Does
Yeah.
that help?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The other one that was interesting to me, I think, you know, quite a bit of our audience lives in the human services industry or education, healthcare, that sort of thing. They're in the business of serving human beings directly. And you talked about this idea of conformity bias. So what's that, and how would you, what advice would you offer up to our audience on that?
Yeah. So again, I think about every bias in terms of what's the risk and what's the treasure. So when I talk about conformity bias, the risk is that it, it's people wanting to do and behave like everybody else. So what happens? Individualism goes right out the window, right? That's a bad thing because now we're not getting perspective. We're not getting diverse perspectives. We're not, people are not feeling like they've contributed or been heard. You hinted at it before when you said, the person who speaks first, everyone goes, oh, all right. They send the signal up. And now people have to decide, do I want to go with the current or go against the current, right? Am I going to toe the line or am I going to say what I really feel and think? And that's what conformity bias does. It leads to groupthink. It leads to not good things for an organization and really bad things for decision making. It's not a good way to make decisions. So where's the treasure? But the treasure in conformity bias is when you think about it in terms of conforming to an organizational mission or an organizational strategy or culture, that becomes powerful. And many of the best leaders out there, all of the public ones that we hear about that have been truly successful, they use conformity in that way. They choose people who can get on board. This is our mission. These are our values. This is what we're up to. This is what we're going to accomplish here. People who can conform to that, that's priceless. But when you take it down to a more granular level in a boardroom where you're trying to make a decision, conformity does not work. That is not the point. We want a diverse set of perspectives so we can arrive at the best possible decision.
Yeah, it's an
So
interesting.
that's
Yeah,
in risk, right?
yeah, that's an interesting way to think about conformity. I have not thought about it that way before. I'll have to noodle on that one. To me, that having people excited about the mission of the organization is the essence of leadership. And
Mm.
in our book, we talk about if you want engagement from your employees, that it's really a factor of two things. It's aspiration and empowerment. That aspiration is something that people have on their own. They aspire to a future and they're excited about something. And so if they have it, you don't have to convince them. You don't have to get buy-in. They
Right.
possess that aspiration inside them. It's an intrinsic sort of motivation. Um, and then empowerment's pretty straightforward. People feel empowered to be able to do their jobs. And so it's a because conformity does have I can see that that's interesting. Like I said, I'll have to noodle on that. Conformity does have sort of a pretty heavily negative weight to it. But I think what I hear you saying is that people that conform are more likely to get on the bus and to be willing participants and moving forward, and not be adversarial for the sake of being adversarial.
Well, that's right. And it is intrinsic motivation. That is the term that I would describe it, right? It's all about how you're hiring, right? So again, why are these things important when you're selecting leaders? Because if you can hone in, if you can get the indication of where their biases kind of position them, and I'm all about unique positioning, leadership is not plug and play, right? It's, you've got to I identify unique positioning through many assessment tools I use, et cetera, for my clients, to the context of the uniqueness of that organization, that situation, that mission, and that particular leadership position. It all matters. And so where you're hiring people into an organization, if you can get a sense of how they lean in terms of their biases and whether they have that intrinsic motivation that aligns with the mission of the organization, that's golden because you're starting off at such a great place, right? That you have people who are going to move in the direction of what the organization rewards and what the goals are, the targeted outcomes.
Yeah, it's the most powerful. One of the most powerful moments you have to shape your culture is at the hiring, um, at the spot of hiring. Is who are you intentionally bringing on? And so many of our clients will use our what we call the Elevate system. It's a 4-factor behavioral model coaching tool, and they'll actually have prospective candidates take it so they get a sense for what are their unconscious motivations, or as we call it, their default success strategies, so that we, not that any of them are good or bad, they all just are, but
Yeah.
understanding what are we looking to accomplish from this role, and how is this person going to help to advance the overall mission of the organization and of our team.
Right.
You mentioned a question. We're almost out of time here, so I want to make sure to get to. I think you mentioned there was a really powerful question that people can ask themselves as a part of this work.
Yep, there is. And this is like my secret question, my secret tool. I've used it raising my kids. I've used it in coaching. I use it with my executives because it's just universal. And it taps into the whole concept of pausing, conscious pause. I'll tell you a story really quick little story. Some years ago when I was coaching, I would say early to mid-career leaders, they were invited to, this was a Fortune 50 company, they were invited to a talk given by the CEO. And it was a very special group. They were sort of high potentials. I had been coaching them for 2 years. And the CEO's up there giving their talk. And I don't even remember what he said, but he said something. And one of those folks like blurted out a comment, and the room went silent. And everyone was in disbelief. Like, how could he do that? After that meeting, everyone was kind of, circling and saying, what was he thinking? And my response was, he wasn't thinking, he was reacting. And that gets us in trouble. Needless to say, the trajectory of his course within the company changed in that moment. That is a moment that changes everything. So the question that I, forever now tell people to keep in your back pocket, and those that I coached, I would say, put it on a Post-it, like in front of you on your monitor, and ask yourself that question at the beginning of every day to help rein yourself in. And the question is, who am I practicing becoming? And practicing is the operative word, because we all have a self-image, we all have a goal, we all wish we want to be this, and that's what I'm becoming. That's great, but it's the practicing that matters. Because if you're not practicing the right stuff, you're never becoming that image or that future self that you see. So in those moments, every day we have moments where we get to practice. We get to do that, right? We don't have to do it. We get to do it. And that improves us every single day. So, when you're in a situation where someone says something in a meeting and you want to blurt out, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. I know that. I'm sure of it. Pause. Take the conscious pause and ask yourself, okay, who am I practicing becoming? Am I practicing being a listener? Am I practicing being absorb what someone's saying and then share how I'm feeling or what data that I have that would support my position? It's just a way like one of those strategies. It's such a simple question, but it's really a way for us to go, okay, I got to stop and think a minute. Let me think about this before I emote, before I act, before I make a decision. I think it's a priceless question, and it's one anybody can use at any time. And you don't even have to understand biases to use it. That's
Yeah.
the best part. But you're still going to improve yourself, and you're still going to help yourself get on the right track and be a more rational decision maker and a more rational leader. And I tell you, I have it on a blackboard in my kitchen, and my sons, who are older now, I don't have to say it. They read that blackboard every morning when they're getting their coffee. And it's like, start the day that way and don't forget the question.
Yeah, I love
I
that.
think it's a good one.
There's always a there's always a gap between stimulus and response, and
Yes.
especially for leaders, especially for CEOs, we're actually called to a higher level of behavior, and so we've got to figure out a way to make sure that we've got the right amount of time and cushion between stimulus and response, because as we go, so goes the team and so goes the culture. So on that note, thank you so much for being on with us today, Lisa. Really appreciate your time. And for those of you who want to pick up your book, it's called Mind Knots. I'm assuming it's on Amazon and wherever else you can find books. And have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. And I really hope that there were some good takeaways from this for you and your audience. And it's really been fun. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.